Imagine waking up before dawn to the sound of hooves. Not the distant movement of an army, but a small, disciplined group of armed men riding directly toward your village. They are not invaders from a foreign land. They are not rebels. They are your protectors. By midday, your grain stores are emptied, your livestock driven off, and your home left smoldering. The men responsible wear polished armor, carry the banners of noble families, and call themselves knights. How did the symbols of honor and chivalry become, for many ordinary people, a source of fear? Most people picture the Middle Ages as an age of noble warriors, men bound by codes of honor, defending the weak, serving justice, and living by ideals we now call chivalry. But the historical record tells a different story. For much of medieval Europe, especially between the 10th and 13th centuries, knights were not protectors of society. They were one of its greatest threats. Not in the sense of chaos or lawlessness, but something more structured. More persistent. In many regions, knights functioned less like guardians, and more like an organized class of armed enforcers, operating in ways that, to modern eyes, resemble sanctioned criminality. To understand why, we have to step away from legend, and into lived reality. The knight did not emerge in a stable, orderly world. After the collapse of centralized authority in parts of Europe following the decline of the Carolingian Empire, power became fragmented. Kings existed, but their control was often limited. Authority was local, unstable, and constantly contested. Into this environment stepped a new kind of figure, the mounted warrior. Knights were expensive to maintain. Armor, weapons, war horses, these required wealth. In return, knights were granted land or income, often by local lords. This arrangement formed the backbone of what historians describe as feudal relationships. In theory, this system created mutual obligation. A lord provided land, a knight provided military service. But in practice, especially in the early medieval period, there was very little oversight. Knights were trained for violence. Their status depended on it. And outside of formal warfare, they often had few restrictions on how that violence was used. This is where the first illusion begins to fracture. Because for many knights, war was not a rare event. It was a profession, and when there was no official war to fight, they found other ways to use it. For ordinary people, peasants, villagers, small landholders, the presence of knights did not guarantee safety. In many cases, it guaranteed vulnerability. Records from medieval chronicles, legal complaints, and church documents repeatedly describe a pattern: armed knights raiding local communities, seizing goods, extorting payments, and enforcing arbitrary demands. These were not always rogue individuals acting alone. Often, they operated in groups, bound by loyalty to a lord, a family, or a shared interest in maintaining control over a region. To you, as a farmer, the distinction between legal authority and banditry could become almost meaningless. A knight could arrive claiming a right to collect dues. If you refused, force followed. Livestock could be taken as payment. Crops seized as tax. Resistance could lead to violence, not always large-scale slaughter, but enough to enforce compliance. And unlike common bandits, knights had legitimacy. They were recognized members of the social order. They carried authority backed by noble titles or alliances. This is what made their actions so difficult to resist, and so persistent. But that was only part of the picture. Because what made this system even more entrenched was how it was justified. The medieval church was deeply aware of the problem. By the 10th and 11th centuries, efforts emerged to control knightly violence. Movements like the Peace of God and Truce of God attempted to limit when and against whom knights could use force. Clergy declared that certain groups, peasants, clergy, pilgrims, should be protected. Certain days were to be free from violence. But these were not laws in the modern sense. They relied on moral pressure, religious authority, and the willingness of knights to comply. And compliance was inconsistent. For many knights, violence was not just a means of survival, it was a pathway to status. Reputation was built through dominance, not restraint. Raiding, coercion, and displays of force reinforced their position within the social hierarchy. This created a paradox. The very class meant to provide order was, in many cases, a source of instability. Yet over time, something began to shift. The idea of chivalry, the code we now associate with knights, did not emerge naturally from their behavior. It was, in part, an attempt to reform it. Literature, religious teachings, and noble culture began to promote an idealized version of the knight, honorable, restrained, protective. But this ideal often stood in stark contrast to reality. For ordinary people, the consequences of knightly violence were not abstract. They were immediate and cumulative. A single raid could mean the loss of a season's harvest. Without reserves, this could lead to hunger, not necessarily immediate starvation, but a slow erosion of stability. Repeated demands for payment, in goods, labor, or coin, created a cycle of dependency and vulnerability. Villages adapted as best they could. Some fortified their homes. Others sought protection from more powerful lords, trading autonomy for security. In some regions, complaints reached higher authorities. Kings, bishops, courts. Occasionally, action was taken. But more often, the system absorbed and normalized these behaviors. So how did this reality transform into the image we recognize today? Part of the answer lies in storytelling. Medieval literature, romances, epics, courtly tales, elevated the knight into a symbol of honor, loyalty, and virtue. These were not records of typical behavior, but aspirational narratives. Over time, these narratives became dominant. Later generations looked back and saw a myth, not the lived experience. When we return to contemporary sources, a more complex picture emerges. Knights were not purely villains, but neither were they heroes. They were products of a system where power and violence were inseparable. And for many, they were something far closer to organized enforcers than noble protectors.